Welcome to Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. We're outside the Ecuadorian embassy in central London. As the Tories try to convince us into bombing Syria to save it, we're going to speak to the world's most wanted publisher, the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, under siege from UK police at a cost of millions of pounds to the UK taxpayer. The WikiLeaks Files has just been published, and it paints a picture of US destabilization of the lives of billions of people right around the world. And as David Cameron finally admits that the UK is involved in extrajudicial killing using the most infamous of ISIS recruitment sergeants, the Reaper drone, we look at the British connection to US atrocities. For all this and the analysis of critical US State Department cables from the millions published by WikiLeaks, let's go underground. Julian, thanks to you and the Ecuadorian embassy for letting us in again. So how do you think this book will address the censoring of WikiLeaks in mainstream media and academia? You outlined that it's banned in the Library of Congress. University students at Columbia are being told not to tweet or Facebook some of the cables.
Well, when I was writing the introduction to this book, I thought, well, we really need to describe why people should read the book. So what's new about it? Didn't the newspapers already cover all this material? Okay, well, the Cablegate cables, that's 251,000 cables, we released them in 2010, 2011. But subsequently, right up through this year, we've published 10 times as many cables. We've now published 2.7 million and another 7.3 million documents altogether. So 10 million documents in total. Why haven't newspapers covered all that? Well, it's a lot of material, but also they engage in censorship, and they do it for a variety of reasons. And cables are very interesting because the way we dealt with the media was we have 100 different media groups we're involved with, and they got the same material. And so you're able to compare the New York Times to Le Monde to Greenpeace, all different groups working with our material, and see that they all have their particular biases, and they select some material, and they also redact cables for other reasons. The big surprise to me was not the media censorship. We've worked out ways to smash through that in certain cases. In other cases it's become very normal, and I think there's even the general public understands now that each media outlet censors things in its own particular ways. The surprise to me was the academic censorship. And the academic censorship is not uniform. Even within the US and UK, the academic censorship is not, for example, in epidemiology. It's not, for example, in computer vision. It's not, for example, in computational linguistics. It's not, broadly speaking, in the sciences or medicine, where there's some 30,000 citations to material in WikiLeaks. And it's not even in the courts. The European Court of Human Rights has used our material, international tribunals, even UK domestic courts. It's in foreign relations, academic journals published in the United States and perhaps in the UK.
They're trying to erase what you've been publishing from the field of international relations.
That's right. And even worse than the US media. The New York Times, for all its problems, published about 100 of our cables. Okay, we've published 2.7 million, so 100 is not great, but it has at least done 100. LA Times publishes, every couple of days there's one media outlet in the US that will publish something. But international relations journals, no. So what's going on? It turned out that there is in fact a formal policy at the largest or the most prestigious international relations journal, International Relations Quarterly. And the editor admitted that he'd been placed in an untenable position by the umbrella organization, the ISA, the International Studies Association. And as a result, there's a policy of not accepting anything derived from WikiLeaks cables because they're nervous about classified material. But other journals in the United States are not nervous.
Well, I want to get into why that might not seem so surprising as we go through some of the revelations outlined in the book. Let's turn to the subject of, according to media at the moment, imminent war on Syria, an imminent vote, who knows, in Parliament again for British bombing of Syria. You outline, or the book outlines, how there's been little change between George W. Bush and Obama, how the US policy all through had little to do with human rights in Syria and much more to do with sponsoring Iraqi-style sectarianism that led us to ISIS and, of course, the refugee crisis, which is making headlines now.
And that's right. If our Syria chapter goes back to 2006, there's a very important cable in 2006 from Ambassador Roebuck, stationed in Damascus. And he writes back discussing a plan for the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria. And that plan is not, well, we should, support the opposition and so on through better media planning and so on. It's to use a number of different factors to create paranoia within the Syrian government, to push it to overreact, to make it fear that there's a coup, to use its maneuvers against Islamic extremists against it. So when Syria says we have a problem with Islamic extremists crossing over the border with Iraq and we're taking actions against them, to take this information and make the Syrian government look weak, the fact that it is dealing with Islamic extremists at all. And then, most seriously, to foster tensions between Shiites and Sunnis. In particular, take rumours which they know to be false, and say in the cable they know to be false or exaggerations, and promote them, that Iran is trying to convert poor Sunnis and to work with Saudi and Egypt to foster that perception in order to make it harder for Iran to have influence and also harder for the government to have influence in the population.
This man Roebuck, now ambassador to Bahrain, so caught there, deliberately trying to foster the kind of destruction that's led to the refugee crisis.
I mean, there's a number of cables speaking about it in the Syrian chapter, but that particular cable, it is really quite concerning. I mean, often cables are written in such a way where you have to read between the lines or look what is not said. In this particular cable, it's just all hanging out, a whole lot of Machiavellian schemes to overthrow the Syrian government.
And it's predating any of the human rights demonstrations against the Assad government?
It predates the demonstrations in 2011.
How do you think, despite, as the book says, the US laid the foundation for sectarianism in places like Syria, causing bloodshed on a unimaginable scale?
What's happened in Syria is really very serious. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people now dead in Syria.
But some countries managed to still succeed despite the destabilization by all these agencies. Iran, Venezuela, Ecuador, we're in the embassy here. How do these countries seem to be able to work their way through it, unlike the Syrian government?
Well, I mean, the Syrian government has managed to survive just. I think you need to look at regional alliances. Part of the problem in Syria is you have a number of US allies surrounding it, principally Saudi and Qatar, that are funneling in weapons. Turkey as well, a very serious actor, who each have their own hegemonic ambitions in the region. Israel also, no doubt, is, if Syria is sufficiently destabilized, it might be in a position where it can keep the Golan Heights forever, or even advance that territory. So you've got a number of players around Syria that are looking to bite off pieces. Whereas in Latin America, if you look at Ecuador, for example, it has relatively supportive states around it. Same with Venezuela, relatively supportive states. And this book documents, for instance, the United States going to Brazil and saying, we want to rein in Venezuela. We want to isolate Venezuela. We think Venezuela is a problem for the region. And Brazil saying, no, our relationship with Venezuela is important. It's an important regional player. We don't want to compromise that relationship by doing anything against Venezuela.
Okay, the book details genocidal US policy right around the world, from Latin America to Asia, all in the name of liberalism, which you write about in your introduction. How does all the torture and killing work with the free market and the use of free markets?
This interplay between big American companies and the State Department and the US military is something that's well documented in the cables. You can see all over the world US embassies acting as a sales agent for Boeing, for Monsanto, lobbying to adjust European law, even to create sanctions or other penalties in relation to Europe for not accepting genetically modified organisms or forcing labeling.
Now we know that maybe within a few miles of this embassy, secret negotiations on TTIP, the free trade agreement, are going on. You've issued a reward for information. So one shouldn't see TTIP in isolation to all the killing and torture that's mentioned in the book?
Well, the US empire, and it is correct to use that word, it's not an empire in the classical sense. It's not like the Roman Empire. It's a little bit like the British Empire, but different. It's a modern empire. You wouldn't expect an empire in a modern age to look like an old empire. Now there's a continental expansion of the United States. Yes, it has grabbed other territories like Hawaii and effectively Puerto Rico and Alaska. But the predominant form that the US empire has is an empire of US bases, now more than 1,400 US military bases in over 120 countries dotted around the world, and an empire of trade. And it uses these mechanisms of its embassies, of its military bases, of its presence in organizations like the UN and IMF in order to secure advantageous deals and structures for the largest American companies. Interestingly, not for the average American worker. So you hear about American interests. It's not the interests of the average American that are being pursued. Of course, it's the interests of the companies that are close enough to the government to be able to have their interests reflected in what US ambassadors do around the world.
In part 2 of Going Underground.
Corbyn, I have thought a lot about this, whether he can survive in a Labour leadership position.
We speak to Julian Assange about the special relationship and when he's going to be free. In part 2 of our interview with Julian Assange, we investigate how liberal values crush dissent and whether the WikiLeaks founder will ever be able to leave the Ecuadorian embassy and regain his freedom. And hand in hand with the banning of information that you were talking about earlier, the WikiLeaks fatwa, which I think is mentioned in the book, there's a mass subversion of information using the National Endowment of Democracy, US aid. They have lots of different non-military, at least on the surface, sounding organizations that are massaging sovereignty, as it were.
Yeah, one of the most important documents we've ever published is the Unconventional Warfare Manual. And what is unconventional warfare? So unconventional warfare is warfare performed through the use of surrogate forces to overthrow a government. That's essentially infiltrate, train, and overthrow. That's what happened, for example, in Afghanistan. It's what happened in Nicaragua. Now that manual, which I mention in this book, it is active policy now in the United States. It's active military doctrine, and it describes that when the United States needs to do something, it pulls together the various arms of American power. Yes, those include the military arm, which we're very familiar with. They also include the intelligence arm, the financial arm, the commercial arm, and its informational power, and its diplomatic power. We bring all of these together in order to push on a country, in order to get it to do what the US government wants it to do. To work in tandem. And under financial power, yes, the IMF is explicitly listed. Under power connected to the State Department, USAID is explicitly listed. What I find very interesting about this convergence of different forms of American power together to achieve an end result. There's different theories of government, different theories of how the United States work. So one theory is you have various rivalrous agencies and rivalrous people within agencies and rivalrous corporations, and so it's actually very hard to get anything done. And there's no doubt there are cases where in the past where that has been true. It's hard to get this mass together. But the formal policy, and it comes together in practice, is actually to pull together all these different agencies, which might seem like they're working different beats, and push them together in sort of pincer formation on a country to achieve a result.
Well, President Obama says that I mean, he obviously doesn't admit that holistic approach of all these different government agencies, but he does say, and he said it at this speech as regards Russia in Ukraine, that for all the criticisms of the United States and the European Union, the difference is they don't crush dissent. Is President Obama lying?
Well, Obama is definitely lying. It varies across the European Union, but Obama has prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined.
He probably wouldn't say it's dissent. He'd probably say that was leaking of secrets.
More than twice as many. Now, of course, he says that that's espionage, but there's no allegation that any of these people have given their secrets to a foreign government or working with a foreign government. The allegations are they're working with the media. Israel
is pretty central. You mentioned Israel there. Do you think denuclearizing, as it were, ending the nuclear weapons program of Israel is really the only way forward? Because the chapter in the book about Israel seemed to suggest US duplicity involving Israel as regards the Palestinians will always be a roadblock to peace.
It's very serious, the duplicity of the US in relation to Israel and the protection of Israel again and again through its veto power at the UN. It's one of these situations where it is only really the United States who has an ability to affect Israel. And so the Palestinians feel that they have to deal with the United States because no one else has the ability to affect Israel because the US keeps exercising its veto. Now we've seen some interesting and clever moves by Palestine around that. For example, pulling in the ICC. And the ICC has been kind of an emasculated organization. Every single prosecution it's had is of an African, no one else. We detail, I think in some ways, one of the most interesting chapters in the book, because it looks at not a country or region, which all the other chapters do, it looks at an international institution, the ICC, and how the US has tried to subvert the ICC by signing secret agreements around the world to prevent extradition of its soldiers for war crimes and other violations. Palestine now becoming part of the ICC and people monitoring that process, it is putting pressure on Israel, and you'll see the number of the cables mention extreme Israeli concern at the prospect that Palestine might join the ICC. It now has joined the ICC.
So do you think that the tide is turning away from your personal circumstances for a second, whether their deployment of missiles, the United States now on the borders of China, or borders of Russia, do you think there's a recognition there that they're going too far, that the global south, Russia, China together could now start to mount an attempt at neutralizing American power, that has gone too far now?
It's very hard to say. If you look at it in raw terms, post-World War II, the US had 50% of GDP, global GDP. And as a result, it was able to set up post-war institutions, multilateral institutions with significant control because it set them up and rules that were skewed to its favor. US GDP is now down below 40% of global GDP. Its military spending, which traditionally has been over 50%, is now down to about 40%. Its intelligence expenditure is still up past 60%. So in some ways it is more than a military superpower. It is an intelligence superpower if you look at the relative spends of the United States compared to others. Now that said, there is increasing integration occurring between states that the US does not control, for example, along the Silk Road. But I wouldn't discount the effect of the United States. There is no country that has anything like 1,400 military bases spread over 120 countries around the world. No one is anywhere near that.
There's some fascinating chapters in the book how you document dissent in Japan and South Korea being crushed by US hegemonic power. Of course, all the talk here is of Jeremy Corbyn, who obviously dissents from US hegemonic power. Do you think the United States will be able to crush his Labour leadership, let alone his British premiership if he's elected Prime Minister?
Well, it looks like he's going to win the Labour leadership election. Now, Corbyn's an interesting fellow. I had experience with him in 2011. He protested in relation to my treatment in the UK Parliament, saying it was unnatural in terms of natural justice for someone to be extradited without charge. They should at least be charged in the United Kingdom. And he proposed amendments which eventually were accepted in 2014 to ban that practice in future. Corbyn, I have thought a lot about this, whether he can survive in a Labour leadership position, taking his historically quite critical line in relation to the UK-US relationship. And to give you an example of just how different that is, a quote from a cable sent by the American ambassador to Washington, D.C. after meeting William Hague, who was the foreign minister in this government.
Lord Hague probably now, isn't he?
Well, he's still an important person in the Parliament. Hague said he, David Cameron, that's the Prime Minister, and George Osborne, the Treasurer, were, quote, children of Thatcher and staunch Atlanticists. America is the essential country. Hague said whoever enters 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship with America. He added, we want a pro-American regime. We need it. The world needs it. And that is such a world away from where Jeremy Corbyn is right now.
That's our Foreign Secretary in the US Embassy here in central London.
And you might go, well, he's just telling Americans what they want to hear, but look at the degree of language. I mean, they're not complete fools. They expect payback on these promises. And Corbyn is not speaking like this. And there is I think there's a real risk to his leadership long term. Interesting question, as if Corbyn could not be kicked out to political destabilization or leaks to the media of intelligence intercepts, his long-term safety. If he kept on a line of saying withdraw UK from NATO, he has already weakened that line, saying, well, it's not the focus now. We need to talk about, what is the role of NATO and so on. Well, fair enough. But if he maintained a very aggressive line of saying we must scrap Trident, we must remove UK from NATO, I would be quite concerned about the risks that he would be intentionally politically destabilized by the United States or something worse. Because we're talking about the relationships between great powers, about the UK's nuclear weapons system, which forms effectively part of the American empire. The US has bases here. Its largest interception base is up at Memworth Hill in Yorkshire. There's over 6,000 NSA personnel working it directly. It's quite hard to undo that relationship. I think my suspicion is that Corbyn will realise that if he hasn't already, and will play it smart. NATO will be off the agenda, maybe fine-tuning UK's role in NATO, and Trident will be off the agenda. I suspect that it's not possible to win an election in UK unless that is done. But then again, no one would have thought it would be possible for him to be Labour leader at all.
And finally, your safety. I mean, when do you think you and Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden will again regain your right to freedom of movement?
Well, Chelsea Manning has an appeal coming up later this year, or early next year. But yeah, she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. That's longer for allegedly disclosing information to the media. Now that's longer than any person who committed war crimes in Iraq, including those who raped and murdered a whole family. That's going to take significant political pressure, change in the politics of the United States before,
and for you and Edward Snowden?
Before, say, Chelsea Manning is pardoned. Edward Snowden, it is not safe for Edward Snowden to be in the United States or any ally of the United States, I believe, until the National Security Agency is wound up. It is a core part of the intelligence community. The core part has about 100,000 people in Washington, D.C., 5 million people overall in terms of security clearances, but the inner core, about 100,000 people. That's a very influential and powerful lobby that simply will not accept a pardoning of Edward Snowden. Not accept it at all. In terms of my particular case, well, the pending prosecution is ongoing. They have 5 charges: espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, computer fraud and abuse, conversion, and general conspiracy. Decades, theoretically, in prison. But it's a matter of politics. It's hard for them to have a big case during the run-up into the election. I don't think probably that's something people want, although you never know. With Hillary, if it's Hillary versus Trump, and Trump's playing the national security Trump card, maybe there is enough incentive then to create a very big case. What is clear is it's politically impossible to drop it. It's just the State Department, Pentagon and so on are simply such big lobbies in DC that it's not possible for the White House, which can be subverted by any of these big groups in terms of leaking their correspondence and policies to the press and so on, and ultimately literally overthrown if Bush really came to shock with the White House and CIA. It's not possible for them to drop it under such circumstances.
Julian Assange, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for the show as Julian Assange prepares to spend his 1,178th night under siege in the embassy behind me. Tell us what you thought via Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud and email. And don't forget RTUK News with Bill Dodd. It's on every weekday evening on the hour from 7 till 10. We're back on Saturday, the morning after Chile's President Michelle Bachelet hosts commemorations for the anniversary of the US-backed 9/11 coup d'etat that saw dictator Augusto Pinochet come to power.